This has been talked about recently in the Education Forum, and I haven't covered it, so I might as well now. This is the anonymous caller to the Tippits in Connecticut after the assassination, a week after the assassination approximately, on November 30th, 1963. And so far as I know, this is the only source document we have describing this, an FBI teletype from November 30th, 1963, to the director, that's J. Edgar Hoover, from the New Haven office. On November 30 instant, Jack D. Tippit, self-employed cartoonist for national magazines and wife, 164 Newtown Turnpike, Westport, Connecticut, advised as follows. At approximately 11:30 a.m. on instant date, Mrs. Tippit received a telephone call from unknown woman who asked if Mr. Tippit was a policeman and if he was related to the policeman Tippit who was shot in Dallas. J.D. Tippit. Mrs. Tippit replied her husband was not a policeman, was distantly related to Officer Tippit, and something I can't read of caller. Probably asking for the name of the caller. On another extension, Jack Tippit listened to balance of phone call. The woman said she could not give her name as she was afraid of being killed, that she was from New York and had to come here to make the call so that she could not be traced as she was in fear of her life. End of page 1. Page 2. The woman requested that nothing be said to the press about a woman calling, as they would know her identity and she would be killed. Note, they don't say who would kill her, just they. The woman said she knew Oswald's father and uncle, who were Hungarians and communists. The woman continued that Oswald's father and uncle had lived at 77th and 2nd Avenue, Yorkville, New York City, that while living there both were unemployed, got their money from the communists, and spent all their time in communist activities. The woman then began speaking indistinctly, disjointedly, and nervously. She stated she had 2 names to give, and mentioned the name of Emil Gardos, and said something about brother-in-law. When Mrs. Tippit tried to find out whose brother-in-law, the woman kept repeating the word brother-in-law. The woman stated Gardos is head of the communists, and that this group in New York now has charts and maps. The woman said something about Weinstock, the editor of, quote, Woman's World, unquote, but did not give further details. The woman said, page 3, the group in New York plans to take over the government. That, of course, they would deny this, but she knew it to be true. She then hung up abruptly. The woman never gave any reason for her call, which sounded local. Mrs. Tippit thought the woman had an Austrian or German accent, while Mr. Tippit believed it was Spanish. Thank you for all the help, the Tippits. Both felt the woman sounded like a mature adult and did not have a youthful voice. Mr. Tippit explained, woman may have obtained his identity from an article on page 1 of Norwalk, Connecticut, quote, Hour, unquote, for November 25 last, which stated that he may be a distant relative of the Dallas policeman. Tippit said article resulted from telephone call from reporter who was checking all Tippits in local telephone directories. Bureau requested to coordinate above with any other information to determine if pertinent, as New Haven has no knowledge of the residents and associates of Oswald's father and uncle. And that's the end of the teletype. Now, on the surface, and my original reaction to this was that this is probably some kind of a crank call or a kook call. That is, the person calling probably is not relaying correct information for whatever reason. And so I never made a video on this because I thought it was just noise. And this is what got me started on this video. This thread in the education forum started by Jim Hargrove, the anonymous phone call to the Tippits of Connecticut. And he actually posts that teletype that I just read. And Hargrove is an acolyte and apparently a representative of John Armstrong, he of Harvey and Lee fame. Now, basically, as I understand it, Armstrong believes that Lee Harvey Oswald was enlisted into a plot in order to give an identity to a Hungarian refugee boy who was a native Russian speaker, in order that native Russian speaker would be able to defect to the Soviet Union as an American agent, and having the advantage of being a Russian speaker, but needing Lee Harvey Oswald's identity so that it would not be known that he was a native Russian speaker. It's a kind of a complex idea, and I'm not sure it makes any sense in the way that Hargrove explains this Connecticut phone call, because apparently their Harvey is being controlled by the communists at this time. So apparently that would mean that Harvey would have to have changed his mind and switched sides to join the American intelligence group. I don't know. I don't completely understand what Hargrove and Armstrong say. But here he says, Hargrove says, we, and by that he means himself and Armstrong, apparently, we believe that Emil Gardos, that was the person mentioned in the phone call by the anonymous woman, named in the FBI report, was actually the Hungarian immigrant Emil Gardos, a Yorkville, New York City resident who was deported for communist activities in 1949. The Woman's World magazine referred to was almost surely Worker's World, a communist or socialist publication. I think they are right about this, that Gardos, as it says in the teletype, probably is Gardos, and that Woman's World probably is Worker's World. Several years ago, forum member for the Education Forum, Paul Jolliffe, made a post that summed up nicely what we can know and reasonably suspect about the FBI report and the anonymous call it referred to. Paul was debating a bit with the late John Butler, and so I've deleted the references to Mr. Butler out of respect for his memory. Here's the rest of what Mr. Jolliffe wrote. The woman caller asserted that Gardos and his son, R. Oswald Harvey, were in Yorkville in the 1950s. Now, if you'll note, the decade is not mentioned in the FBI teletype. Apparently that's a misunderstanding, but that misunderstanding gets perpetuated in this thread in the education forum. That is, the misunderstanding is that since they think that the 1950s is the time period mentioned in the teletype, they have to explain why their theory says it has to be the 1940s, when in the teletype the anonymous caller does not specify the decade. The impression you get is that it's current because she talks about them planning to take over the world and all that, and having maps and charts to do that. So it gets very confusing here. Their explanation for the teletype gets confusing because they're explaining away something they don't have to explain away, technically speaking. That is, since the anonymous caller did not specify the 1950s, they don't have to explain why it's not the 1950s, but they do anyway. So that can confuse things. Now, I think probably the reason this confusion is there is because that the evidence we have indicates that Oswald and his mother Marguerite were indeed in New York City in the 1950s. And that's pretty solid. That at least somebody using the names of Lee Harvey Oswald and Marguerite Oswald were in New York City, and presumably it was the real pair. Though Armstrong has a theory that both boys, Harvey and Lee, were in New York City at the same time in the 1950s, and with different mothers. I don't want to get too far off into this because it just gets needlessly complex. But the point here is that they add a complexity by saying that the anonymous caller specified that it was the 1950s, or the 1940s. I get confused just trying to explain it. And they have to explain that. No, they say the caller said it was the 1950s, but the caller did not say that. Now, the reason they have to make it the 1940s is because Emil Gardos left the country in the 1940s, so he couldn't have been seen with Harvey in the 1950s. So it kind of makes their explanation convoluted. So continuing with the Hargrove post, the woman caller asserted that Gardos and his son, our Oswald Harvey, were in Yorkville in the 1950s. That was impossible. Gardos was deported in 1949. Although the woman did not have the right years, that by itself did not completely invalidate her call. The key to the FBI document was not in whether Oswald Harvey was the biological son of Emil Gardos. Instead, the importance of the FBI document was that it was demonstrated some kind of relationship between Gardos and Oswald Harvey, a relationship the FBI was desperate to hide. It's entirely plausible to me that Oswald, killed by Jack Ruby in Dallas, was Hungarian by birth. The way the FBI hot-potatoed the report of the mysterious woman's call to Mrs. Jack Tippit showed that the FBI was very, very concerned about this woman's information. Further, we know the FBI hid that information. They knew instantly, and he didn't say how he knows that, but presumably it's because the Warren Commission did not have this document. They say that means the FBI hid it. They knew instantly, and the FBI hid a lot of stuff that way, they knew instantly that the woman was referring to Emil Gardos and Fred Blair. Now, I think probably the FBI would have known that she was referring to Emil Gardos because the FBI dealt with Gardos, they haven't mentioned who I'm going to talk about yet, but this made the news, and the FBI certainly knew about it before it made the news, and after it made the news, they certainly would have been aware. Well, they would have certainly been aware of Gardos as a communist and possible agent for the Soviet Union. They would have been aware of that. So if they didn't know immediately, they certainly should have been able to figure out that the caller was referring to Cardos, not Gardos. By the way, it turns out that the highly suspicious asterisk over the underlining of the name Emil Gardos on the teletype on the report itself actually was done by the FBI, not John Armstrong. That's probably correct. The FBI would tend to mark names that they investigated. But it's possible that whoever made the original report didn't know that it was referring to Gardos, but somebody in the FBI central headquarters figured that out, and that's why the name is marked and underlined.